For our august gathering tonight, although it is only June, I thought it might be interesting to make a brief presentation on the history of Covina High School, and also throw in a few tidbits on my own personal history. Covina High was founded in 1899 and is thus one of the older high schools in Southern California. For the first 4 years, the students met in the same building as the elementary students, as we see in this photo. Because they were involved in higher education, the high school students met on the second floor. Lillian Harris, in 1901, was the first graduate of Covina High. She was in a class by herself. Contrary to general belief, I was not in that first graduating class. The school was at the corner of Citrus Avenue and San Bernardino Road. In 1903, a new building was erected next to the grammar school for the high school students, as we see here. It was in use for only 5 years, as in 1908, a bond issue was passed to build a more modern structure, which opened in 1909 at the corner of Citrus and Puente Street. The building shown here remained unused for a few years, then was sold to the Masons, cut in half, rolled across School Street, and still exists in 2011 as the Masonic Hall. This is a photo of the new high school shortly after it opened in 1909. This would remain the location of Covina High until September 1956, and is the school from which Shig and I graduated. Here is an aerial view of Covina High from the 1930s. In the early 1920s, a second building, the Science Building, was constructed next to the original school building, as the student body was slowly but steadily growing. Until the 1950s, Covina High included students from Baldwin Park, Charter Oak, and West Covina. The West Covina area had only a few hundred inhabitants until after World War II. In this aerial photo, you can see the gym behind the two classroom buildings, and across Puente Street, outdoor basketball courts, the baseball diamond, and the football field, now the district field. Let's now take a look around the school. Here is the school orchestra led by Professor Groom about 1910. Girls participated in the orchestra at that time, but not the marching band. Note the many stringed instruments. Here we see the marching band about 1910 between marches. Perhaps the most famous graduate of Covina High School internationally is Roy Harris, class of 1916, who became a noted composer of classical music. His symphonies are still performed by the major orchestras of the world. Now it's time to root for the Covina Colt teams. Here's the boys' 1904 football team. Their average weight that year was 135 pounds. They are a bit heavier today. That year, Covina and Pomona played a 5-5 tie using rugby scoring rules. The Colts did not join the league, the Central League, until 1915. Here, with Puente Street in the background, is the 1921 football team. Note the leather helmets. They did not win many games in 1921, but 4 years later, in 1925, under Coach Chief Newman, were Southern California champions and played Bakersfield before 40,000 people in the Coliseum for the state championship. We lost, unfortunately, 14-13. This is the girls' 1908 basketball team. The third player from the left in the front row was my girlfriend. Imagine today's girls trying to play in those uniforms. They would really sweep up and down the court. Here are Covina High tennis players in 1908. Covina had good tennis teams in the early years. They were always on the ball, ready to serve, and thus able to net many victories. Here is the 1919 boys basketball team. The average height was about 5'6" or so. 4 years before, in 1915, Covina played Whittier for the first CIF Southern Section Boys Basketball Championship. Since Whittier played indoors, but Covina played outdoors at home, the first half of the game was played indoors and the second half outdoors. Covina lost 38-32. This is the 1915 boys baseball team, showing they were on the ball as they strike a pose and hope to be a hit in the upcoming season. The 1923 track team was league champion. Bill Temple on the far right in the back row lived to the age 104 and just died about 2 years ago. Until about 1985, all the events were measured by the English system, not the metric system. So it was 100 yards, not 100 meters. In 1923, the school record in the 100-yard dash was 10.2. The equivalent today in metrics of about 11.3. In the 100 meters today, we have a somewhat faster runner on this year's team. An interesting note, in 2011, more than 15% of the student body is out for track. So far, we have looked at Covina High in the early years, from the end of the 1890s through the Progressive Era, World War I, and the Jazz Age of the 1920s. We now come to the 1930s, when Shig and I were born. I was born on March 21st, 1932. The first day of spring, I sprung. The 1930s were the years of the Great Depression. When I was born, everyone was depressed. Here I am with my parents, who no doubt were happy I had shown up. For many years, from the 1880s to the 1950s, the growing of citrus was the major industry around Covina. Everywhere outside the old mile-square center of town were orange groves. It was great growing up here in Covina, as kids could run for miles to the groves. People seldom locked their doors, and on non-school days, the only rule was to be back for dinner. People seldom ate out, by the way. I remember there were 2 Buddhists who owned a citrus grove in Covina. Every day they would sit under their orange trees, contemplating their navels. Here in this 1935 photo, we see Garvey Avenue looking east to Kellogg Hill. This is now the 10 freeway. Note, as far as you can see, are orange groves. My dad and his brother came to Covina from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1928. This was their 10-acre orange grove in Charter Oak. It is now the location of Cedar Grove Elementary School. In the early 1940s, during World War II, gas was rationed. Thus we couldn't drive very much. So here I am riding my horse to grammar school. His name was Giddy Up. This transportation had its ups and downs, but already I was a Colt fan. Then, a few years later, I became an apprentice member of the Covina Mafia, as seen in this photo. I wasn't very tall then. 65 years ago, in September 1946, I entered Covina High as a freshman. Here we see a group of cheerleaders in the late 1940s. As you can see, the cheerleaders had big pom-poms in those days. I always liked big pom-poms. In this photo from the 1944 Cardinal, we see 2 Covina High students at the Sugar Bowl, the famous teenage gathering spot from the 1930s to the 1960s on Citrus Avenue, featured in the Herald teen comic strip. Note the wall ad, 12-ounce root beer for 5 cents. Just a few weeks ago, the Sugar Bowl was reincarnated at its original location on Citrus. The prices now are slightly higher. This photo shows a prom court in the early 1950s. We usually had the prom in the gym in those days. The limousine drive was not as far. After 4 years of meandering through the curriculum, I graduated in June 1950. Here, from my 1950 Cardinal, is a photo of the high school snack bar, where I spent a good amount of my time. We didn't worry about calories each time we ate in those days. Here, I am among the graduating seniors. We were a distinguished-looking group ready to take on the world. A few weeks after this, the Korean War began. And here is Shig as a distinguished senior with some of his classmates. By coincidence, among his classmates was Paula Jean Myers, also in the Covina Hall of Fame. She was an Olympic diving medalist in the 1952, 56, and 1960 Olympics. A big change came to Covina High shortly after Shig and I graduated. The campus was moved from the corner of Citrus and Plenty to its current location at 463 South Hollenbeck. The first classes at the new campus met in September 1956. Because of the huge population increase in the 1950s, the old campus proved to be too small, and it was not considered to be earthquake-proof. In 1950, Covina had 3,900 residents. In 1960, only 10 years later, the population had soared to 20,000 as the orange groves were replaced by tract houses. All of us who graduated from the beautiful old campus look back on those days with fond memories. Now here we have a few photos of the new campus taken in 1957 and early 1958. This is the quad area. Note the lack of trees, but there were picnic tables. Another view of the quad. In the 1950s, we were technologically up to date, fruitomatically speaking. Put in a dime and out comes an apple, very appetizing. And here are the computers of the 1950s. They were called typewriters. Probably no high school student today has heard of a typewriter ribbon. We were a very courted group in those days. All students had lockers. This eventually ended when a few students began keeping strange things in their lockers. By the way, this is not me. There would have been more girls around. Those days, every girl had to take home economics because the higher authorities assumed every girl was going to grow up and be a housewife and stay at home and take care of the kids. Thus, real live kids were recruited for practice. Most of them survived the experience. Then in the early 1960s, I returned to Covina High School and taught history for more than 35 years. Here's a typical day in my Advanced Placement American History class. As you can see, some of the students are more advanced than others. Then the picture Time Man of the Year. At one time, this photo could be found on most post office walls in the local area. I was on the walls so much I became a stamp collector. I thought I retired in June 1998, but I guess I really never went away. I'm still having fun around the school with the Scholarship Federation, taking students to the World Affairs Council, reviewing for the AP test, and rooting for the Colts sports teams, among other things. So it has been 65 years since I was a freshman in 1946 at good old Covina High. World War II had just ended, and for years after, we had an ROTC unit at school. Harry Truman was president in 1946. There have been 11 presidents since. The Korean War, the Vietnam War come and gone, and now we are in the war on terror. Through it all, Covina High has survived, grown, and prospered. To be a part of it so long has been a wonderful, fulfilling experience. Finally, in the words of that great American philosopher, Yogi Berra, Sheik and I want to thank all of you who made this night necessary. Thank you so much.